Our session is Research and Grants, Finding Opportunities for Your Project. My name is Andy King. Many are tasked with raising resources for their organization, and with lots of resources available on writing grant proposals. There's a tool that's out there on how to do the research to find the right funding opportunities that fit the needs of your organization and the particular project that you're working on. So for this session, to help you with that particular task, because you won't be able to apply for a funding opportunity until you've done the research to actually find the grant opportunity. I mentioned my name is Andy King from the Training Unit, and assisting today on the session are Rob Stegman, Shannon Derry, and Danielle Ricks, all of whom are campaign consultation. Now for today's agenda. We're going to start by getting a sense of what kind of experience you have with researching grants, to give us a sense of who's on the session today, and so we have an idea of where we might want to focus some of our attention. Next, introduce to you a step process for researching funding opportunities, and then narrowing them down and finding the ones that will make the most sense for you to pursue. Examples from vistas who are currently serving, who have had various degrees of success in finding the right kinds of funding opportunities for their organization. So you'll get to hear what they did, how they did it, and what worked. We'll get some effective practices, and after then we'll move into the question and answer portion. And then to introduce to you today, Lois Morgan. She's one of our lead presenters. Lois is a blended learning instructional designer. She works at the Bank Street College of Education in New York. Lois is involved, along with others at Bank Street, in helping develop the curriculum for PSO and some of the ongoing training that we offer to this space. So now I'll turn it over to Lois.
Cindy, and welcome to everyone here on the line. I'd like to start with the learning objectives for the webinar. Hoping that when you've completed this session, you will be able to determine appropriate methods and activities for researching grants in your particular organization, in your particular community, and with your very specific program needs. And we're hoping that you will actually begin to start researching grants for your project. The VISTA Campus Forums are a place where, as you know, many VISTAs go to express their successes but also their frustrations. One comment that I found recently expresses something that I think other VISTAs who are tasked with this responsibility to research grants may very well relate to. This particular forum post read, "Hi, I just started my year of service and I am supposed to be researching new grants and contracts. I have no idea what to do or what I am doing. Does anyone know of a good book or any websites? Thanks." This webinar is in part a response to that request for help. In order to get a better idea of who's out there today on this call, what your level of experience is or inexperience with researching grants, we're going to conduct a poll. Now, if you could look at the bottom right of your screen, there's an indication where the poll is, and there are 4 different choices. The question is, what best describes your situation with researching grants? If you can take a moment now to check off one of those 4, which range from no experience and you're alone and don't have any help to you have lots of experience and you feel very comfortable. Check off one of those things. Now you'll have about a minute. And then it will be a few minutes for the poll to actually assemble the results. So while you're doing that, I'm going to go to the next slide and find our term. What do we mean by... Yeah.
I'm just going to let you know I can't advance the slide quite yet. I'm waiting for the poll to close, but we'll do momentarily.
Okay. So 2 minutes to fill it out. Okay, we are. So why researching grants? It is the process of discovering and cultivating funding opportunities up to actual grant writing phase. It encompasses these 2 broad categories of activities: the online research or exploration, and also engaging with the local community by talking with people and meeting with people. The webinar is going to be spent exploring these activities further. Pleasure to introduce to you Mo Hyman, who will be leading in that exploration. Is the founder and executive director of College Access Plan, which is an educational nonprofit in Pasadena, California. She's a professional fundraiser, has previously been a university and community college English professor for over 15 years. She is also currently a VISTA supervisor. Now I will turn it over to Mo, who will continue our discussion of researching grants.
Lois, and hi everybody who's on the line. So we're just going to dive right in and start talking about what are the best ways to research grants and to identify viable opportunities for your organization. So on the next slide, we're going to see the 4-step process. And these steps don't necessarily happen in a linear fashion. The first one, usually uncovering opportunities, that's pretty much the first step. But beyond that, all of these steps are important and involved in the overall process, but you might arrive at them at different times depending on the kind of research you're doing. But we're going into each one of these steps in more depth over the course of this webinar. Moving on, next slide. The first step that we're going to talk about is uncovering opportunities. And this step really includes 2 fundamental components: talking to people in the community and internally in your organization, as well as searching online and doing sort of prospecting research. And on the next slide, we'll begin to talk first about having conversations with people. And some of these things might be obvious. Talk to people in your organization. Talk to people that you know. Some things that I think are important to add to, for example, talk to the organization staff and volunteers, all the way from people who are only in occasionally in the office, all the way up to the CEO, about previous grants. What grants have been previously funded, or what organizations have previously funded the organization, what foundations, and then perhaps most importantly, what grants are currently active or are on hiatus. Some foundations will not allow organizations to return for a particular amount of time. So after they've received a certain number of grants from a foundation, they have to take a year or 2 off. Sometimes I've heard 3 years off. So you want to make sure that you aren't going after any grants or starting to work on and learn more about anything that you just can't viably go after. And that's going to come from internal knowledge. Secondly, what types of funding are the most pressing need for the organization immediately? So specific projects or programs, what is the organization most immediately trying to fund? So you can start making a priorities list. We're trying to fund this project first, this project second, and also getting a sense of how much funding has been raised for each project so far, because that will be information you'll need to know as you're going out to talk to foundations and corporations about funding. So you want to be able to review as many previous requests as possible to get a sense of how the organization is presented in grant requests. So you might want to sit down and talk to people about the language that the organization chooses to use, the identity, the way that the organization likes to present itself when going out in the community. Obviously, talking to other VISTA members, leaders, and supervisors about their experiences, about things learned along the way. The next one is local retail stores, banks, and things go on in your local community. Those we like to call low-hanging fruit. What that means is it's easy. You go in, you ask whether or not they have a pool of money set aside for local organizations doing the kind of work you do, and usually it's a pretty quick process. They're either going to give you a thumbs up or thumbs down most of the time. And you want to find out who's funding your local nonprofits doing similar work, and even not local nonprofits who are doing similar work, and who been their funders. Sometimes that's making a phone call, and most of the time we'll talk about that in the next slide where we talk about, or in the next section where we begin to talk about online searches. But right now that we've covered talking with people, I'm actually going to go on to the next slide and introduce you to MJ, who is one of our VISTA presenters, and she's going to talk about how she identified an opportunity for her organization using some of these tactics. And it's all yours.
Everyone, my name is MJ Matson. I'm currently in my 9th month of service as a volunteer coordinator at Urban Roots in Reno, Nevada. Quick about Urban Roots, we're a nonprofit that focuses on garden and nutrition education for the community. We have education programs for K through 12, community workshops, and the school garden program at 10 of our local schools that's been to help create school gardens and integrate them into their curriculum. My main focus is volunteer management and outreach for all of our education programs, our demonstration farm, and our shops. My most recent experience researching grants was with the Wounded Warrior Project. I actually found out about this grant opportunity by sending an email out to a few peers in my network asking anyone had previously found funding or grant opportunities for veterans. I was quickly told about the Wounded Warrior Project and checked out their website. After doing some research on that, I found out that their grant cycle was coming up, so I spoke with the recreation therapist at the local VA hospital who I had been working with to try and get a garden space for veterans. I got the go-ahead from them to submit a letter, or once I got go-ahead from them, I submitted a letter of intent to the Wounded Warrior Project, and of the 600 submitted letter of intents, we were one of 120 applicants asked to submit a full grant application, which we submitted on July 3rd, so fingers crossed on that one. Please. My tip for researching grants is to be persistent but not annoying. What I mean by this is I think it's extremely important to embed yourself within your community and to network yourself to those around you and find out who in your community has grants or has previously funded projects with a similar mission to your organization. Find out who they are. You can introduce yourself and your organization and really be persistent about creating a relationship, building a relationship with them, and finding out about their grant opportunities. Just don't be annoying. There's a fine line between the two, and you really don't want to cross it. That's my tip. Thank you.
My name is Janelle Canals, and I'll just be doing a little bit of the next portion on the grant that I found. I'll be completing my first year of VISTA service in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico next month. And I am the marketing director, but I'm also in charge of fundraising. And currently serving at the Boys and Girls Club of Sierra County. It's a nonprofit organization that offers a variety of after-school programming and recreational activities for youth members between the ages of 12 and 18 or 6th through 12th grade. Slide, please. Okay. So I worked on the 21st Century Grant this year. It's a federal grant, and it's funding for the Boys and Girls Club for the next 4 years, including some staff, so we're really excited about it. I love this opportunity from knowing a little bit of my organization that we had formally received the 21st Century Grant, and we're getting a notification that RFP would be released again. we kind of get notification through our partnerships with New Mexico Child Care Associations and the After School Alliance. On the Public Education Department website every week, and that's important because sometimes when grants come out, there's only like a couple of weeks turnaround time for you to get the writing part that you have to do, but also all of data and the assurances and letters of support and stuff. So it was a struggle to get this in, but we were able to, so we were really excited. Next slide, please. The paying for profit organizations to doubt grant alerts hasn't worked for our organization. I found that it's much better to research it on your own, especially at the local and state level. It builds relationships and increases networking, and it matters that people know your organization personally. So if you don't know where to start little. Learn your organization's needs. Attend some town hall meetings. Spend a day at the public library looking through the resource area. Community foundations will know about private grants in your area. You can what state and organizations that your organization works with, for agencies, and search those organizations' RFPs and find out if they post online, or if they have an email list that you can get on. And know if an RFP is coming out ahead of time, you can ask for examples of some grants that these agencies have funded. Probably the most part for me, being like a new grant writer, was to look at copies of successful grants. So that ends first by staying informed by networking with similar local and state organizations. Sometimes you can ask for a previous sample of grants that they've written that has been funded, especially if you won't be competing for the grant. A previous example can really be a huge asset. What are funded, they are public information. So, for instance, in New Mexico, I could go to Santa Fe and request a grant that they had funded, but you can only do that if you have enough time. But in different organizations, sometimes with a grant there's enough funding to go around, or you're not in competition because of location. So our organization will give out copies of our grants to other private organizations because they kind of keep the grants in the hands instead of public organization hands. So it just depends. I've built some connections. Don't be afraid to ask for copies of grants. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Janelle and MJ. And actually, as we continue to talk about online searches, we'll also discuss some of the routes that both Janelle and MJ took. So those were pertinent examples for what we're going to be discussing right now. And we're going to talk about what are some of the online tools that you can utilize. And there are grants from the federal government and the state government and government agencies, as Janelle just discussed, from foundations, from corporations or corporate foundations, and from through collaborations with other nonprofits. And what I mean by that is sometimes a nonprofit has received a grant, even a grant like the 21st Century Grant, they either can't spend on their own, or they need partners to be able to execute all of the parts of that grant. And so sometimes by just talking to people in your community, you can find some collaborators that may have funding that they're able to share. So moving on to the next slide, see some of the resources that are available to you. And there are all these different resources, the Foundation Center, GrantSpace, GrantAlert and grants.gov are both free and available online, as is GuideStar, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the Foundation Center and GrantSpace are generally going to be made available to you through local resources, like a lot of libraries may have the Foundation Center online at the library. And here in Los Angeles, for example, we have the Center for Nonprofit Management. There are other centers throughout the country that are similar, and they're just basically libraries specifically for nonprofits and for public organizations who are looking for funding and other resources. The great thing about being able to use libraries and organizations that have such kinds of libraries is that they usually have a librarian who knows how to use the tool very well. And so what I suggest everybody do the first time you choose to use the Foundation Center website or portal sort of research tool is to sit down and really talk to a librarian or an expert about the best search terms, the best way to look for the right kind of grants for your organization. And so those resources, those human resources, can really add capacity to your ability to seek grants. And you set yourself up for grant alerts. So if you work for an education organization like I do, you can do grantsalert.com, and they'll just send information to your email. Grants.gov will also send information to you, so you can sign up for all of these resources, which will help you keep track of what's going on out there, and you won't miss any pertinent opportunities. And lastly, one of my favorite deeper dive resources, and we'll talk about the deeper dive in a little while, is GuideStar.org. Some of your organization has a free login for GuideStar. Usually there's a limit to how much information you can get until somebody has filled in a profile for the organization. And then once you've filled in the profile, you have more access to more information. And it's in organizations' best interest to fill out this profile, because this is a lot of foundations and a lot of funders will use to research your organization. It really is sort of seen as the main resource for just getting big information like your mission and your finances and things like that. So you can find out the same kind of information that foundations are looking for on your organization about them. And the great thing about GuideStar is that you will have the most up-to-date, usually, Form 990s, IRS Form 990s, for the foundations that you are looking for. And you literally download those 990s and use them to identify whether or not they invest in organizations like yours, of like size, of similar mission, with similar goals, if they invest heavily in your area, and those kinds of things listed on their 990. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what are some of the other things to look for on the 990 when we get into the deeper dive portion. And so for now, I think we're going to move on and see whether or not there are any questions up to this point that those of you on the line have come up with so far. So I'm going to hand it over to
Danielle.
Okay.
How are
Good.
you?
There you go.
So we do have a couple of questions. One, someone asked, where do you look for education-related grants? It's a big question for this VISTA.
I would say it depends. From my perspective, because I do education, it depends on what kinds of grants you're looking for and what kinds of research you're doing. So obviously education grants and signing up for those kinds of resources that we just talked about online, and that are I forgot to say that they're also available on the online source that's linked. You can go through and click those links online tool, and it can take you to, those will take you to a lot of these kinds of resources where you can literally just set up an alert and they'll send you updates of what grants are available for either smaller organizations or organizations who are looking for foundation funding when you're not going to necessarily get the same level of alerts, or if you're looking for local funding, which one of our VISTAs, I believe it was MJ, already spoke about and is very, very important and is going to end up being a big theme. Looking for local funding, I would say you will use a foundation center. And what's important about that is just making sure that you have very, very clear search terms. So you want to not only search for education, Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is big, although that might be the way to do it. But you might start there, and then if you find that you're just not finding what you need, you might individualize your search, meaning I do college access work. So yes, that's education, but it's more specific than just education. So I would put in college access and see what foundations in my area pop up under that. So it's a little bit of around the waters, but generally you do research for education grants just the way you would for any other.
It does. So one of the questions coming in is, where are good places to look for grants for operating support? Again, foundations, government stuff will never do operating. But foundations will, and a growing number of foundations are understanding that it's very important to invest in operating support. The most important thing will be, obviously going to the Foundation Center online and seeing who funders are available, who's popping up in your search, and just looking at the report. It basically gives you a report, and the report will say what kinds of funding they do. So that's sort of one way to do it. I very rarely, honestly, to be totally honest, use the Foundation Center, because what I do is I just prospect around like organizations. So I find organizations that are like mine in my area. I look at their website and see who funds them. Then I go to those foundations' websites if they have them, and I look to see what funds. Usually the foundations, if they do list their previous grants on their website, will say what they funded for. So it will say for the college project or for general operating. The third tool that I use is going back to GuideStar, is downloading a Foundations 990. If you get a list of foundations that you think are interesting and perhaps they don't have websites, or their websites don't list grants, or some of them don't have a very complete profile on Foundation Center, so you have to go and look for more information, their 990 is the place to go. On 990, they have to say, first of all, how they accept submissions, what they do to accept submissions, and then they have to list all the grants that they've given and what they've given those grants for. So at the end of the 990, you'll really see a list of grants and what funded, and that can give you a sense of whether or not they fund general rating or whatever it is that you're looking for. Great answer. We have 3 more, and then we're going to move on. And one we're hoping you can help this Vista with. Mm-hmm. She would like an overview, or where she could turn to an overview of NIH terminology on the format of the FOA web pages. We weren't sure if this was something the panelists could answer for her, but we told her to take a stab at it.
Tapped out. Who wants it?
Anyone?
Vista out there who has done some work with the NIH, maybe in the chat you could provide some support about doing that, or where she might go for resources.
Great one.
Yep.
So this question then is, since federal grants are so competitive, are there ways of increasing your chances, ways of getting more information on finding the priorities of the funder that may not be clear in the FOA?
Yes. Here's my top 2. Number 1, get collaborators. It's really hard to go out after federal funds on your own. You need good, strong collaborators for 2 reasons. Number 1 is they want to make sure that you have they're just long. They're long applications, and they're going to be really, really hard to write on your own. And have a number of collaborators just takes a lot of the burden off of you and gives you more voices. It also is everything in federal right now. They're looking for collaborations to fund. And so it's just a really competitive way to go after those grants. And the last thing I would say is pay there's no real stick to it outside of writing it well. And I'm sure those of you who have written federal grants know that there's essentially a point system. They rank you based on your responses, and they'll usually tell you that, we give 10% of the attention to this area of the grant and 50% to this area. So obviously what that says is that 50% part they're going to be looking at with some great scrutiny, and you want to make sure that you answer all of their questions succinctly, in detail, and with a lot of numerical data, quantitative data.
Great answer. Thank you so much. One last one, and then I'm going to turn it back over. And this
comes from one of the Vistas, and she's saying, is GoodStart.org available only for groups that have been officially designated nonprofit? Her group has submitted the paperwork but has still not been granted 501c3 status yet.
That's an interesting one. What I would do is go on and try to make a profile. And they're not granted 501c3 status yet, but they probably do already have an EIN number. So I would submit it with their EIN tax number and see whether it lets them create a profile, because I know that generally you need to have a login to access some of the deeper dive information like the 990s, but really it's free to create a profile for your organization. It just takes a little time, and it's really good for newer organizations to do. It sort of gets you, it's a place where people can find out more about you, because when you're new, and I was once new, I'm a founder, people are skeptical about you, and so it's a good way to show that you're taking all the right steps to make sure that you're leaving a sort of a trail behind you. So just go ahead and try to set up a login and see, using your EIN number, whether they let you do it.
Great. Still have some more questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can, but right now we're going to turn it back over and keep the presentation going. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you for the answers.
Yes, thank you. There were some stumpers in there. So now we are going to move forward to our next Vista. Is on my thing. So it's Jared. And Jared's going to talk about, again, some of the resources that he found useful while seeking grants for his organization. So go ahead, Jared. Welcome.
All right. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Jared Bowes. I'm a resource developer for the Greater Baltimore Urban League, the Baltimore branch of a national organization whose mission is to enable African Americans and other minorities to secure economic self-reliance, power, and civil rights. As a Vista, my top priority is diversifying their funding streams for their college access and youth development programs. So in addition to drafting letters of support and letters of inquiry and preparing all kinds of documents, I do lots of grant research too. Next slide, please. Thank you. With this particular grant, I found out about it through my supervisor. I started conversations with her about major players in the nonprofit scene who might be interested in our organization's programs, and she brought up ABLE more than once as a potential funder. So from the beginning, I knew they were a big deal, but we didn't know whether they were necessarily a perfect fit for the programs that we were trying to fund. And 3 months later, when we decided to explore ABLE as an option, it was my responsibility to investigate and determine how well our program lines up with their areas of interest. So the thing I did was visit the foundation's website and locate its on grant making, because on many foundation websites you can find their criteria for eligible programs, the types of grants that they offer, and and application instructions. And of those resources, the first thing I checked were the program areas and the past grantees, which identified the foundation's areas of interest, what they funded in the past, and what they're funding right now. In ABLE's case, their interests regarding education very closely match the goals of our program, and they've funded quite a few organizations that share our program's goals or have similar program design. So it was a very good fit. And I read their foundation's guidelines and procedures for applying and used that to draft a letter of inquiry that was tailored to the rhetoric that I found on their website, which the administration and I edited in a couple of sessions and sent out a couple of weeks ago. So in a nutshell, the research process for this one involved talking with my supervisor about leaders in the local nonprofit scene, then going to that foundation's website and sifting through everything that it had and judging whether it's a good fit. And I'm sorry to deviate from the slide here, but I'm happy to say that we got a letter back from them ahead of schedule, so this grant is active for us. We're in the running.
Woohoo!
My tips are, one, to definitely use the local library because odds are that you'll have access to Foundation Center databases or other resources. I've read some very valuable books that are available in my library's nonprofit section. And when you do a funder search, please be very specific. Yeah, check the websites of foundations and nonprofits for lists of donors to not only a feel for the scene, but also a feel for fit, because you don't want to waste time producing proposals for organizations that don't necessarily fit your program's goals. And find using online databases, and actually I would amend this to include like even Google searches, and enter specific search terms and narrow it down as quickly as possible, because it's one thing to, I think it's been mentioned before, it's one thing to sift through, like, say, college access foundations. It's quite another thing to sift through the thousands and thousands of foundations that are interested in education. Narrow down and specific, and be creative. I just try to find certain words, certain terms that are in your like service area that can show up on foundation websites.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And the really cool thing that's starting to happen is what you're probably hearing are a lot of similar experiences from the three Vistas you've talked to and the things that I've been talking about, that there are things that sort of have worked as best practices. And so now I'm going to start pulling some of these things together to talk about how in the world do you prioritize all this information? What do you do with it once you have it? So the first thing that has been reiterated a couple times is, first of all, start local. Look for foundations and corporations that are interested in your area, somewhat specifically. So sometimes when you're adjacent to a large city, for example, you might end up with foundations that really, really, really love the large city but never invest in anything that's adjacent to it. Or alternatively, you might find foundations that are actually interested in looking for those outlying areas that might not have as many resources funneled into them. You want to pay attention to what are they investing in. And next, want to for foundations and corporations that are interested in specifically what you do, and I believe we've spoken to that quite a bit. So I'll move on to 990s for grants to similar organizations. We covered that during the question and answer session, but definitely take a look at what's at the end of the 990s for some of the foundations that you're interested in, and see who they're funding and what they're funding. Like our question about general operating, if your priority, if your ED says we're looking only for general operating, all of our programs are paid for, we really need general operating, and you find out that a particular funder really only funds programs, you're going to deprioritize that funder for a later time. And we're really going to, and then lastly, you want to know all of your I'm going to skip the 1, 2, 3 system for 1 second and say you want to know all of your deadlines. Keep all of your deadlines organized. Obviously, for example, there's a foundation here in California that accepts grants only once a year. So if they accept grants, I believe, at the end of January, if it's the beginning of February, you're going to deprioritize that just by virtue of it being the deadline being far away. They're not even going to look at it for another year. So you want to make sure that you have a sense of all those deadlines. And then we're going to use what I not creatively have termed the 1, 2, 3 system of prioritization, and that's just figuring out, okay, who's most likely to invest in our organization, in our mission, in our current needs, and in our organization's size and location and all of those things. Who hits every single one of those targets? And if they do, obviously are in your number 1 list. Your number 2 list might be, let's say, for example, a foundation who says, yes, we absolutely invest in education, but you might look at their information and see, in the last 3 years they've given 1 college access grant, and the rest of their grants have been towards, 5 education or something like that, you realize, oh, this isn't a high funding priority to them. We might be interested in talking to them, but we might need to deprioritize them a bit. And then lastly, the 3s are, those really big grants that you might not be likely to guess you've pulled together a lot of resources, something that might be a little bit of an overshoot for your organization. And I think we're going to hear about those experiences down the line, some grants that might be not quite as interested in your organization. And then the last one, and we'll talk about this further on the next slide, is foundations that do not accept unsolicited grant proposals. And we'll talk in a moment about what that will look like as we are now on our Looking for Traps. Perfect timing. So, for example, foundations that do not accept unsolicited proposals. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of foundations, particularly small local family foundations. So when we say local, you get all excited about those little foundations, but what you'll find when you look at their 990, and a lot of these foundations do not actually have websites. And what you'll find when you look at their 990 is it says we do not accept unsolicited proposals. The first thing to do with those is make a pile to your executive director, if you have one, director of development, and say, do we have a relationship with any of these foundations? Because it's no longer a trap if they already know you. But it's a trap if they don't know you, because then what you're going to have to do is build that relationship. That doesn't mean that is not going to happen. It just means if you're looking right now for some grants you can write up really quickly and relationships that are easy to build, the ones that you want to build relationships first are usually the foundations that are looking to build new relationships with organizations that are not saying, hey, we basically fund this group of people, we're not really interested in talking to new organizations. You can definitely build those relationships down the line, but again, for immediate, I got to get this done, you probably want to deprioritize those. And now you want to make sure that the grant maker doesn't have a very specific focus. I just gave an example of that a little ways back. So if they only seem to fund elementary education and that's not what you do, or they fund STEM education and that's not really, like, you could shoehorn it, but it's not a really good fit, you want to deprioritize that grant. And then note that corporate funders and corporate foundations will always have a trap. They're not a trap. The trap is usually that they want to know your organization. Their sort of trap is they would like to see that members of their corporation are volunteering for your organization is one popular one. Another one is they would love to have a member of their corporation on your board or on your advisory board. And again, those are things that are surmountable traps, but we're looking to turn something around quickly. That usually takes a little bit more cultivation than you perhaps have time to do. Or really quickly post a volunteer opportunity on, send out to their volunteer coordinator or something like that. So you just may need to develop a different strategy with that. So talk to them first before you submit anything. Look for a contact on their foundation, on their corporate foundation website, who you can email to or have a conversation with, and then talk to community members or other nonprofits. I found out about which corporations are most likely and least likely to invest by talking to other organizations and finding out who they have relationships with. That's usually the best way to go with that. So those are all the traps I have. Now that segues perfectly into this idea of doing the deeper dive, digging a little bit deeper. And so this is our next step in the process. Now that you've sort of prospected and gone out there with your little gold pan and figured out your basic information, now getting into, you found little flecks of gold and you're getting ready to dig in a little bit deeper. So your goal is to have information from the website of a foundation's website about proposal process, what the expectations are, what information they want from you. Calling other organizations to do deeper outreach, although I would say before you call partner organizations or people in your community, I'd first know who their funders are and do a little bit of looking at the funder. The great thing about that is then you can call them from a position of strength. You can call an organization in your community and say, hey, I see you've been funded by the Joe Smith Foundation, and I noticed that they funded you for general operating. Do you know whether or not that's something they usually do? Hey, who's your program officer at the Smith Foundation? I would love to get in touch with that person and see if they'd be interested in funding us as well. So that really does help that you've done that research beforehand when you do make those calls. Then assess how much work is involved versus the payout. And what that essentially means is there are grants out there, some of you have come across them, that are like 3 or 4 page proposals for $2,000. And that's great if you have plenty to give for $2,000. But when you're prioritizing and you're looking for larger funding, you may want to deprioritize that just by virtue of how much work goes into it and what the payout is. And sometimes that could be a $2,000 government grant, but if you're not going to be particularly competitive in the process and you don't have any partners going out with you and you're not entirely sure what the benefit would be doing it outside of it being an interesting exercise, you may also want to deprioritize that. And then you just basically go back to your 1, 2s, and 3s and you shift organizations around. And I used a highly super fancy way. I make an Excel spreadsheet with 3 tabs, 1, 2, and 3. I just cut and paste and move foundations around as they change their priorities on my list. On that spreadsheet, I, of course, have all of the deadlines, what kind of funding I'm interested in asking each foundation for. So is this general operating? Is this for a specific project? I will have how much money I think I can ask them for based on their previous giving to other organizations and their strategies and what they do and how they advertise grants. And that's how I reprioritize my list through my deeper dive. And we can move on, and we're going to meet Joe. So interestingly, and this dovetails really well, Joe will talk about an opportunity that's worth going out after, but maybe been one of those more reach opportunities. So Joe, it's all you now.
I'm Joe Barbary, and I'm with Rural Action in the Plains, Ohio. So we sort of serve Southeast Ohio. Rural Action's membership-based rural development organization that is on different sectors as part of a whole in developing regions in kind of a sustainable way, ways that are more self-reliant and empowered. So focus on forestry and waste, water restoration, and agriculture, which is what I'm involved with. So I'm finishing up my first year as a VISTA, and I'm beginning my second year there, where I'm working sort of as a development specialist, doing a lot of writing, and it's really evolved to writing as well. So we've had success with grants through the USA, small community organizations, sort of local funders. But what we talk about today is a little bit of an interesting experience we had. I was told about the ODA's Specialty Crop Block Grant. Through our connections, we have partnerships in the area that have really existed for years through our work in the area. And when we found this, the first was to talk to our executive director, my supervisor, because they've had extensive experience with the Department of Agriculture in the state, to kind of talk about if this aligns with our priorities, if it makes sense for us to go after, if it's worth our time, and feasible in a lot of ways. So really, the writing process and the researching process were kind of one and the same, and we were discussing, if this made sense for us and how to proceed. So knowing a few of these things, we went forward and applied, put together a strong proposal, and we made it to sort of the first round of selection. We went up to the CLIS to kind of have a meeting with other potential candidates and kind of give our pitch again, try that second round and get through that. But unfortunately, we weren't picked. And so it's to my tip overall. connections and what that means for your grant writing and what it can potentially, the headaches it can potentially stop, I guess, ahead of time. They're so necessary. In connections, we're really talking about partnerships, not of people so much as just a connection towards another me, really as a partner who you can really talk to and understand an opportunity, or you really go forward and put a lot of effort into something that you might not get. And it's a tough process, and it involves really from the ground up just talking to people who you work with, talking to people in the community, and all the advice previously is just imperative in the grant writing process. Our organization's been built on years of past VISTA support and relationship building, and what's been really important is not ignoring these connections we've started, but really fostering them, getting them going, so that when we find out about an opportunity, we can only apply for it, but really understand if it's worth our time. So I'd say bottom line.
Great. Thank you so much. And on that exact same note, we're going to begin talking about building those relationships now with the foundations and the corporations. And so we'll move on to the next slide. I don't think much more needs to be said about what relationships means. And talk about what are some of the effective approaches that you can use when you're calling a foundation and you want to build that relationship with a program officer. And the first thing is get the right person on the phone. And we talked about that in the previous step. And so step we talked about, hey, calling some of your fellow organizations and saying, who's your program officer? Who do you think I should talk to? Who deals with this area at that foundation? Maybe college access. Who's their college access contact? And so you want to make sure that you're talking to the right person. And the next thing is you want to have a specific and brief list of pertinent questions. And this is sort of one of those secrets of the grant prospecting process that a lot of people may or may not be aware of, which is you are always supposed to make a phone call. You're never supposed to just send something blind. The only time you would send a proposal or a letter of inquiry blind is when they literally will not give you a phone number, and when you call, it just rings off the hook. There are a couple of those foundations off there that simply will not talk to you, and you just got to send it out and see what happens. However, foundations, you make sure you make that phone call, and you make sure you've done the appropriate research in the previous steps, so then you know what they fund. You know what their process looks like, what the kinds of questions are that they're going to ask on their proposal, or that you're going to need to include answers to in your letter of inquiry. And you want to not call them and say, hey, so what do I put in my proposal? Because then they know that you haven't done appropriate research. But you do have to ask them some sort of question. You can't just call and say, hi, I want to be friends with you, because that doesn't work very effectively. So my suggestion here is to have a list of questions that might be on that deeper dive step we talked about before, that digging deeper step, where you've found out through your research that they may sometimes fund general operating, but always. One of my favorite questions for new funders is, I noticed that you funded general operating for other organizations in the past. Do you find that to be an effective tack to be used by organizations that you have not funded before, or do you save general operating for organizations that you've already built relationships with? It's an easy softball to lob, and they understand that you're really trying to understand their giving design and how they do it. So come up with some questions that are specific enough that you can't really get the answers on their website to justify the phone call, and then hopefully, usually they'll start asking you questions, and they'll start talking to you in asking more about your organization, and voila, you've already started to build that relationship. The one trap I would say in this area on this step is that there's some foundations that are very small, or sometimes they're very large but only have one person who's doing all the work, and that's often an executive director or a president. Say before as a VISTA, before reaching out directly to a foundation executive director, you might want to go to your executive director or development director if you have one and say, hey, I have a relationship with this person. Would you like to make this phone call or start building this relationship, because sometimes having sort of lateral relationship, somebody in your organization who has the same position as the person that you're calling in your foundation can give you a leg up as well. And just if you're making a call to somebody who's at that top echelon of a foundation, that you get clearance from your ED or from your development director to be making that call and building that relationship yourself. And so moving on to our final major step of our conversation today is responding to deadlines in a timely fashion. And this obviously is kind of a big duh, but probably needs to be repeated for a couple of reasons. You just want to make sure that you don't miss anything. The biggest trap here is that you could potentially miss a deadline because you've not been able to gather all your information before you get to that point. You're doing it last minute and you realize, hey, why does nobody in the organization know where the 501c3 letter is? That probably won't happen, but I've heard of it happening before. So you want to make sure, a while before the deadline, you start gathering all your information together. And that might be your 501c3 letter, your Form 990 for the organization. You're going to need to work with whoever does the budgeting for the organization to make sure that the project budget that you're sending with your proposal is appropriate and matches what the foundation wants to fund, meaning you do your research, do they fund staff? Some foundations don't. Do they prefer to put money towards buying equipment rather than sort of other things? You need to find out so that you can write the most effective proposal and that your budget matches that proposal. So that would be what I'd say is your final step. And then the other thing is understand whether or not the foundation requires a letter of inquiry. Say 2, maybe 3 pages where you just give them an overview of the organization's history, programs, and what you're asking for in this proposal. And to the next slide, we're just going to summarize here. And about uncovering opportunities, where we talked about both having conversations as well as doing a little bit of online prospecting. That digging deeper, which is learning more information about the opportunity and making your list and making sure that you've prioritized your 1, 2s, and 3s. Relationships with foundations as well as other organizations and corporations, all the right people. And lastly, making sure that you respond to deadlines and so that you have making sure that you have the right information in front of you so that you don't make any mistakes when you're sending out your proposal. I know that there's a couple of things I just wanted to reiterate that I thought were important. Don't phone calls without a decent sense of what you're looking for. So it's probably not a good idea to just call a partner organization and just say, hey, I want to know more about grants. Look at their website first, see who funds them, see whether or not they even get grants. Some organizations bother with this process. So make sure that you know what you're looking for before you make phone calls. And that goes doubly for program officers at foundations. You have your list of questions in front of you. Have a good sense of your organization's history with funders, whether or not they've been funded before by a foundation and what that relationship was like. Did they ever drop the ball on anything? You may have to do some repairing of a relationship, or you may have a great relationship, but you might not be able to go back to that foundation for another year. And, of course, learn about who are potential collaborators. Joe said this, and it cannot be stated strong enough. Who are collaborators or partners in the community? Everybody's looking to fund collaborations, and specifically at the federal and state level, you're going to want to make sure that if you're going in alone, it's because you really are the only organization that's able to do that work. You should otherwise consider going in on those big grants with a collaborator. It's usually the most effective way to make sure that you get that money. So my last closing idea is we're going back to the phone lines now, right? Is that
yes? Oh, good. Yes, we are. We do have some more questions. And the first thing we want to do, though, is open the phone lines. I'm actually going to turn it over to Robin for a moment.
Great. Can you open the phone lines for us? instruct us callers of how to use it?
In order to ask a question over the phone, please press star 1 and record your name when prompted. To your request, you may press star 2. When to ask a question, please press star 1. 1 minute as we wait for questions to queue.
While we're waiting, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A that we'll ask. So our first one is, where are other good places I can look for grants for education, financial literacy, and financial stability other than the IRS and banks?
A lot of foundations will do financial literacy funding and education funding. And so I would say, again, we'll just go back to those tools we discussed. Go to Grant Center. First and foremost, I would say go to organizations in your community or at least in your county or general area. We have sort of the broader Southern California area. I know other states have those kinds of swaths of a region. And look at organizations that also do something related to financial literacy, see who funds them, and find out from them. And then you're just going to go through the process as we discussed. Track out the Foundation Center at your library, Foundation Center resource at your library or local Center for Nonprofit Management type organization. And look at the 990s. Use GuideStar and look at the 990s for those foundations whose names pop up when you're looking for financial literacy, and take a look at who they've funded and what the names of the projects are they've funded. And if they look like they're interested in that, then that would be something I would pursue. So I think that all the steps that we've discussed are pertinent to that specific search.
Great. I have another question. Can faith-based organizations apply for federal grants?
My understanding is yes.
Great.
From that, my understanding is that that was something that a Bush-era change in the law that faith-based organizations with certain kinds of programs are able to apply for federal funding.
Right. So certainly you have that in the grant guidelines.
Yeah.
The other question is, where can I find information on grants for funding for an L3C company with nonprofit enterprise models? Yes.
No, it just depends. That is out of my bailiwick. Anybody got anything on that?
To that, if there are vistas who are also working with L3Cs, if you have resources, put them in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, when talking with the program officer, if they did email, is it acceptable to email them questions, or should you try to track down their phone number?
It depends. Yeah. If the website very clearly states that email them, I will email them. And one way to do that is to reach out to them first and say, I have some questions. This is who I am. I have some questions for you about priorities or process or whatever. Would you prefer that I submit them in an email, or would you like to set up a time to talk? You have to put the questions right out there. You can see if you can get them on the phone, which is the ultimate goal, obviously, for building relationships. You can't.
So let's have Graham answer your questions in the Q&A and see if we have questions that have come in on the line.
We do. It comes from Harry Colbeck. The line is open.
Everybody, I'm trying to get a heads up on my particular project. I'm putting together a housing proposal for senior citizens and also another for low-income housing or low-income individuals. We have the support of the city. Our NGO will be the sponsor. We have another organization putting together a feasibility study. But when I go to look at government things such as HUD, what do you know about how the sequester is cut funding and USDA rural development? Is there actually money there for these projects? Can we get grants, or is it going to have to be all borrowed money or a combination? Or do you have any suggestions on finding money for that type of project?
Building?
Yes.
An actual physical structure?
Right. We believe that the county will be able to, because there's some local properties that have back taxes. They're also going to help us and waive the taxes and give us a place to build it. Our small town definitely needs housing, both for senior citizens and for low-income people. People are living in, it's been talked about for 20 years, hasn't been able to get it together. We hope to do it this time.
Got it. Well, I would say two things. One is there might still be HUD funding. I mean, generally the funding that's already been proposed or that's in the pipeline might still be available, and then some of it probably has been affected by the sequester. I don't know quite as much about that. What I would say from a grants perspective is look for grants that fund your area or your county or your general swath of the state and that do capital funding. So capital funding is specifically for building projects and physical things. And sometimes what you can do if you're doing it depends on how your organization is going about it. If they want to launch a whole capital campaign, that's a lot of undertaking, and it takes a lot of going out into the community and talking to people and doing marketing and PR, and sometimes it's a really big undertaking. But the nice thing about a capital campaign is sometimes what you can get is somebody who wants to put their name on a part of the building to give a lead grant, to give lead funding for that project. And sometimes if you have that lead, it's easier to find other funding from other foundations. They like to compete to put their names on buildings, so that's kind of nice. Once you get one with a name, somebody will say, well, I want a room with my name on it, and I want a garage with my name on it. So that's one way to start getting people essentially competing to put their information to put their names on your. And then the second thing is sometimes when you have funding or you have a lead gift on a capital campaign, that help you be more competitive in the federal or in like the HUD process where they want to see that you have an investment already made. And if there are limited dollars through HUD, then that might make you a little bit more competitive when you go out.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, we're such a small community. The local money is pretty hard to come up with. I don't know. There might be someone sleeping with a bag of money and wants to put their name out that we haven't found yet. But thank you for those recommendations.
Sure.
Time, I show no further questions in queue.
Great. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A. One question is, if a funder wants to see leveraged funds, what is the best way to acquire letters of support and intent from partners?
They want to see leveraged funds. So they want to see, well, there's a couple of ways that can be done. That's an interesting question. I mean, it really just depends on what you're leveraging, right? So for example, I'm assuming that person means that they have in kind or resources that they use in their community that they're leveraging to show that they have infrastructure or capacity around whatever project they're building around. I would just go to your partners and ask them for a letter and send them a template. Basically, them a bullet-pointed list of what you need and why you need it and the value of those resources, and just have them sort of rubber stamp that and write it up in a letter for you, and you can promote it there. I don't know if that actually addressed the question appropriately.
I think that works. So we have one more question here. Other questions when you're calling up a potential funder, would you ask them beyond just do you fund general operations?
Oh, it depends on. This is a critical thinking portion of the game, and I would say it really depends on what you're looking for, what relationship you have with the funder previously, and where. Basically, you're just trying to be creative to look at their website. The goal is you're going to look at the website, see what information is readily available. You do not want to ask them something that you can answer yourself. You do not want to ask them something that's so out of the blue that they're going to say that's a ridiculous question. You want to ask them something that you couldn't necessarily find just by looking at their website and their 990, but it's related to what they do to get the conversation started. So it might be a question like another example of a question that I use is, do you have a certain percentage, if they don't say this on their website, I should say, do you have a certain percentage of a project that you'll fund up to, for example? So a lot of funds will only fund 25% of a project. Do you want to know that? Another question that you might ask is, do you require that we've already raised funds for this specific project, or are you willing to give seed money for a new project, or are you willing to be the first investor in a project, or something along those lines? Other questions I've asked, one of my favorites, but it's because then you have to meet it, is ask whether they'll do a challenge grant to another foundation. So you can actually play foundations off each other. That relationship, as you get to know the relationships in your area, you start to realize that some of them vie for supremacy in some ways. They want to show that they're the best funder. So one way you can do is call a foundation that you might already have a relationship with, who's already funded you, and ask them whether they would be willing to make a challenge grant to a new foundation that doesn't know you. And then you could call those foundations and ask them whether or not they would be interested in a matching grant situation. So there's a couple of different things you can use depending on the relationships.
It did. Thank you very much. And the lesson we have right now in the Q&A is what are good places to look for when you're just starting up as a nonprofit and need startup costs?
Oh my, let me tell you, not easy. There. You obviously want to look for organizations that say, one nice thing is if they say we do seed money. That's always nice. That means that they're willing to be the first investor in a project. That's never a bad sign. Sometimes it's more little foundations and organizations that are more interesting in taking those kinds of steps. But the most important, I would say, is you have to start building your individual program, your individual giving program first. And that can be really hard if you're like me and you don't really know anybody who's got money in their pillow, but not know a lot of people who are super passionate. That'd be a little bit tough because they pretty much just carry around change, not money that folds. You want to try to build that individual giving, and that means going out in the community, talking to people, getting a couple of investments. And you actually use that challenge format in the opposite direction. So you can basically say, hey, we're looking for seed funding for our organization. We have $1,000 from members in our own community who have decided they want to invest in this project. Would you match the investment from our community members? So that's a nice little tool that you can use when you're starting out to build confidence in foundations, from foundations.
Great. Do we have any questions left on the line?
At this show, no questions in queue.
Great. We don't have any questions in our Q&A at the moment, so
Great.
We can move on.
Great. So I'm just sort of down to the next steps phase, and then I will out. The next steps, I would say, are number one, check out that online module on the Vista campus. That's actually it's a really fantastic resource, and one of the great things it does is it links you directly to some of these researching grant resources that are there. Secondarily, obviously, you want to start identifying those libraries and centers with research tools that you can use. So get on your Google right after you get off the phone today and just find out where those resources are. And, of course, I want to reiterate again that the best thing about using those resources at the library is that there's an expert librarian sitting right there, and they can help you find the best search tools and the best ways to narrow your search. So I would, before you dive right in, don't be embarrassed to somebody and say, I've never done this before, help me. You'll get a lot of resources that way. Create an organization system. It can be more exciting than my 1, 2, 3 method, but you want to make sure that you prioritize your grants, because your first time out on Foundation Center, some of you who work in big cities might come back with 500 foundations, and I'm nothing. So you want to make sure that you've prioritized those effectively. And moreover, I would say some of those you want to do a quick scan of their funding and their priorities and whether or not they give or where they give. Some of you might just want to tuck a file somewhere and not even put on your spreadsheet. And then lastly, gather those internal documents long before your deadline so that you're not scrambling at the end of the day. So that 501c3 letter, an advance ruling letter if your organization has one, your most recent Form 990, your financials for the previous year if your organization is large enough to have an audit, and most organizations that are 500,000 or over, at least in California, have an audit. In some states it's 2 million. So it just depends on whether or not you have an audited financial statement. If not, you probably want to get a copy of your organization's internal financials for the previous year. So whatever the financial statements were that your organization submitted to whoever the accountant is who does your 990, that would be your balance sheet and your sort of income expense detail. You want to get a copy of those because most foundations will require some sort of financial statement if you don't have an audit. And lastly, your budget, your organizational budget for the current fiscal year or for the fiscal year that you're asking, or I would say for the fiscal year that you're asking funding for, as well as the project budget. If you're obviously going for general operating, you won't need this, but if you're looking for a specific project, you're going to need to have that project's budget in front of you, even long before you get started on the proposal. So everything costs. That's my next step. So I'm going to now hand it over. I think that's my portion.
This is I'm going to lead you through a little bit of navigation to show you how to actually get to the Research and Grants module on the campus. Okay, the first this is the home screen for the Vista campus for the Vistas. Now you go into the work, click on work, and then you go to the fundraising section, which is right in the middle on the top. You go to the box on the upper right, which says Writing Grants and Proposals. And when you get there, the very first thing listed in this list of resources is the Research and Grants Flash module, which is the one that we referred to earlier, and which is one I think that you should spend some time exploring. Clicking on that module, let's get into the module itself. This is the home page, and I just want to give you a little sense of, this really tells you what's actually in the module. It's divided into 3 different sections, little tabs up front. First is Basics, then On the Web, and On Foot. Now the Basics just gives you background information on the Research and Grants process. It includes things like glossary terms, strategies for doing research. It even points you to free webinars and classes, both online and in person, that are around the country to help you get a sense of what you're doing and what the best way to do it is. Tab is where we go into more detail on the tools, the online tools that we've talked about earlier. We have a section on the Foundation Center, the Grant Space, Grant Alert, grants.gov. And within this section, we actually give you links to the specific areas that are relevant for you to explore. And it gives you all kinds of detailed information about how to search. One of the things that's very useful about this is that this is stuff available to you just online, and it's all free. You do have access to specific subscription-based things, but this is everything you find here is free. And the third tab is On Foot, and we go a little bit into detail here about into the community and talking to people and the different kinds of organizations and stores and retail areas that you should explore. Is just a summary of what's in there. It is very rich and detailed, and I think would be very helpful to explore. To the next.
Liz and Mo and our fabulous Vistas for joining us today. We the evaluation has been open, and you should see at the bottom of your screen. We're going to wrap up here, but please take a few moments to share your feedback on our session today. What you provide for us helps us continue to improve the webinars for VISTA. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We will have our next topic webinar next month, Mapping Assets to Build Community, which will be a really great webinar about how do you find those hidden assets in your community and bring them together in a way that helps you build partnerships and build capacity in your community. So that's on August 21st, here again at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And as always, you can, if you have any further questions, you can contact us at vistawebinars@cns.gov, and you can always access previous webinars on the ongoing learning page in the VISTA campus, which has also a complete schedule and all of our webinars on demand. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month.